So thank you again for joining us for Tales from the Crypt. My name is Allison and I work for St. Mary's County Library. So our guest tonight is Dr. Jim Gibb, who will be discussing archaeological investigation of cemeteries. All right, are we ready to get started?
I am.
Excellent.
Okay. First, we have one more presentation this calendar year in November, talking about some of these small rural house sites we find throughout Southern Maryland. And then we have a couple of talks scheduled, I think, for January and February. For those of you in St. Mary's County, you might find one of them particularly interesting, and that is an industrial archaeologist, me, looking at Cold War era aviation catapults down at Pax River. So I'm going to be showing lots of pictures of these subterranean machines that would catapult aircraft off the airfield as part of testing for use on aircraft carriers. So it's not your typical archaeology type talk. So as for today, I'm talking about the number of practical uses to which cemetery work can be put. And in setting that up, I was thinking, well, we're not, scientists often deal with theoretical issues and developing and testing theories. And it occurred to me while watching the news that most Americans don't know what a scientific theory is. So I thought I'd spend a minute or two and just talk about that before I go to slides. A theory is a statement about how different phenomena are related to one another. And it's a statement that is then testable. It has test implications. And it can be disproven. A statement that cannot be tested and that cannot be disproven is not a theory. I don't know what it is, but it's not a theory. So when you're listening to the news and you hear this phrase, and I will never use it again in my life, you hear this phrase, conspiracy theory, that's an oxymoron. There's no such a thing, okay? There are fantasies, and maybe even malignant fantasies, but theory has got to be testable and it has to be subject to disproval. Okay. That said, I'm going to share my screen and just say just a little bit more about that. Okay, so each year I do a talk, Tales from the Crypt, and this has absolutely nothing to do with ghosts. So if you've tuned in for that, you're going to be sadly disappointed. I'm a scientist. We deal with the things that are measurable, observable, and that kind of rules out ghost spirits, hobgoblins, and all those other sorts of things. But each year I bring in some new material and get rid of some old material, so the talk changes from year to year. So what got me into that little discussion about theory is that I set this up to talk about different things we can learn by looking at cemeteries. So tonight we're going to look at epidemiology. We're going to look at world politics, documenting people who are not prominent in the historical record, largely because they didn't produce written documents or their written documents were destroyed. And then archaeological investigation, which involves those three and other things, including looking at certain theories. For instance, one might theorize that people express present relationships amongst themselves in how they treat the dead and how they organize cemeteries, for instance. Okay, so we're going to kind of stay away from the theory for the most part, really talk about these practical issues. First up, epidemiology. In what was then Baltimore County in the early 20th century is now within the northern bounds of Baltimore City. About 10 years ago, we looked at a cemetery, and I don't know how well you could see my mouse moving around, but left of center, there's a cemetery here, part of Notre Dame Academy. I have a close-up of it. There we go. This is St. Mary's Church and Cemetery. And we were doing some archaeology there some years ago because there was some drainage issues and stream erosion and whatnot. And in order to correct those water issues, the city of Baltimore wanted to make sure there weren't any graves near where they were going to disturb the ground. And so that's what we were looking at. It's a really wonderful cemetery, lots of fairly large monuments there, as you can see here. There are a few that have been knocked over, there are a few that have been damaged, and certainly there's been a little bit of vandalism. Some of this is just the cemetery hadn't been maintained as well as it could have been, and so stones start falling out of plumb, eventually topple over. But in general, the cemetery is in really nice condition. What's interested me at first, and this had nothing to do with why we were out there, but just walking around looking at the stones, some of these nice large stones would have something, as in the case of this one here, in memory of Edward Cairns, born May 1830, died 1879, native of the county of Wessex, Ireland, Wexford, I'm sorry. Also his wife, Anne, 1827-1902. Not only does it tell you that they are from Ireland, but even tells you what county they're from. And this has nothing to do with epidemiology, particularly. This has more to do with identity, but I show it to you now. What really was interesting about the cemetery, cemeteries are wonderful if they have markers because they have birth and death dates. And the death dates are really interesting because you can graph them. How many stones were erected in 1876, for instance, and you can make a nice graph out of that. As you can see here, it starts out in the early 1800s. Really 1848 is part of the Irish migration to the New World when that cemetery begins. And you see a fairly steep climb and then, kind of shoots up in the late 1860s through early 1880s. And it drops down again, peaks again in 1905, and then again in 1918, trails off to the late 20th century, at which point that Irish-American community probably has largely dispersed. But those peaks are really interesting because they're telling us that a bunch of people, a greater than expected number of people died in certain years. And so we might ask, well, what was going on in those years that caused this, for lack of a better word, a die-off? That's not in the stones. The stones tell us when people were, died and buried. It doesn't tell us necessarily what they died from. The fact that very rarely, when a stone does, it's usually somebody who's fallen in the military and who's died in action. So 1918 should be pretty obvious to everybody. That's the year of the Spanish influenza. And you can see in this distribution here, in April and October, 2 peaks in the number of deaths. And those correspond to peaks in the mortality worldwide, or at least North America, from Spanish influenza. So that cemetery kind of manifests this worldwide event, the pandemic, Spanish influenza. And it also kind of tells us how that influenza acted. It kind of peaked and it died down during the summer, and the fall in October of all months, it built up again. Sort of an abject lesson for the current pandemic. 1905 is kind of interesting too. You see a remarkable peak in March, 26 people out of 41 who died during that calendar year. I've only taken a quick glance at the newspapers and the Baltimore Sun for that month. I haven't had a chance to study it, but most of what I ran into with an initial inspection was deaths elsewhere, like Louisiana with yellow fever and the like. But that's something that can be researched. I noticed in walking around some cemeteries that there's what I would consider, just impressionistically, a surprising number of people who died relatively young, under the age of 50. And that's something that could be interesting in looking at the health of certain small communities. World politics. I love this story. This is a site over near Crownsville, just west of Annapolis in Anne Arundel County. And it's a farmstead burned down in the 1920s. And you can see very nicely the remains of the house, barn, other sorts of outbuildings. Really kind of interesting site. And in fact, we found it this time of year, all covered with fallen leaves. Well, associated with this house site, with this farmstead, you can see on the left, the house site would be in the center of this tract of land here. And the red ellipse indicates this cemetery just below, less than half an acre cemetery. If you look at that cemetery, there's only one headstone and one footstone. And on the headstone, we have this German Gothic typeface, and in German, that it marks the grave of Frederick J. von Schwertner, March through July of 1901, so an infant. And then this quotation in German from a prominent nationalist poet and politician in Germany. Keep in mind, this isn't really true so much today, but there was a time when poets really played a major part in politics in European society and even in British society, even in the American colonies. So a popular poet could actually get a pension and might have a better chance of being selected for office. To the right is my translation. I don't speak German, so it's rough, but it says, "You came, you walked with a quiet step, a refugee guest in this land. From where? Where? We only know, from God's hand into God's hand." So it's kind of sentimental, but the thing is, was written in German and was taken from this nationalist poet. Here are some details about the farm site in general. Frederick von Schwertner, 1855-1921, bought the farm in South River, again, near Annapolis, in 1896. He was a German immigrant, as was his wife. He returned to Germany in 1914 because his native country was at war. Mind you, by then, he was no spring chicken. He's 59 years old. But he returned to Germany to fight for his country. Now, he probably didn't expect this to happen, but in 1917, the US declared war on Germany. And, if he's serving in Germany in whatever capacity, he couldn't very well just sort of, say, so long, guys, I got to go back across the ocean and put on another uniform. So he was kind of stuck there. We don't know if he wanted to stay there or not, but he was stuck there. In 1917, the US passed a law, Trading with the Enemies Act, which is still on the books. And because of that law, the United States government seized the farm. And so the family ended up leaving. And it wasn't until some years later that Friedrich and Anna's son, Ernst, was able to sue in court and at least get back his father's half of the farm, which was taken. His mother's half, I think, was sold or something. I don't remember the details. But there's this, in this story, we have identity, these people identifying as German, even though they're living here. And we get into world politics and how world politics affected even as a single household. Finding forgotten communities. Some years ago, I was doing an archaeological survey near Davidsonville in Anne Arundel County. And it was, again, like around this time of year, it's beautiful, leaves are down, it's a beautiful, comfortable day. And we started walking around and seeing in one of the areas, we saw a series of linear depressions and pieces of rock where we didn't really expect it to see rock. And when we cleared off the leaves and started looking at this carefully, it's a little hard to see here. You can see a little bit in the shadows. These shadows mark a series of grave fossae or grave depressions. And so this is a cemetery, and at many of them, there'd be a stone at one or both ends of these fossae. Let's see if I could make this go ahead now. There we go. And so we mapped it using a total station, but I just use these symbols to mark The pentagons represent stones, the black ellipses represent grave fossae, and presumably there are a lot more graves in there. Now you might ask, well, how do you really know? I mean, you didn't dig these guys up. How do you know they're graves? Well, while doing some subsequent deed research, I found that a surveyor ran a line right through this cemetery, and he recognized it as a cemetery. We're pretty sure it's African American. There's some deposits nearby outside of our project area that look like they're middle to late 19th century. It looks like this is a cemetery associated with either an African American household or maybe even a small African American community that remains to be documented. Had we not seen this, we would not have known about this community. And of course, my favorite is Archaeological Investigation, where we look at all this from less of a community standpoint and meeting community needs, and more just about archaeology, about discovery, and about trying to understand periods of the past as well as human behavior in general. And so one major project that I've done over the years has been the Patuxent Point site, which I've talked about before. 17th century Anglo-American plantation site on the Patuxent River, just above the Thomas Johnson Bridge that takes you over into St. Mary's County. And so the arrow points to this large graded area, aerial photograph taken at the time. I suspect we'd just finished our excavations, but you kind of see black plastic covering a lot of stuff. And in the foreground is the Compton site, which was a slightly earlier 17th century plantation site. And it's kind of important to the understanding what it is we found here. So after sampling the plowed soil there for artifacts, we stripped it using machinery. Believe it or not, that is me, full dark head of hair, nice legs. We stripped it, and in doing so found a series of what were certainly grave shafts. So we'd found a cemetery. We weren't really looking for it. We were trying to expose the house site that was there. And so discovery of the cemetery was actually inadvertent and rather inconvenient too, because we didn't really have the resources to excavate it. But here's a map of the entire site. And over in the lower right-hand corner are the post holes that mark the pattern for the house. It's roughly 40 by 20 feet, with the chimney bay at the north end of the site, the upper part here, and a large trash fill pit, mostly oyster shell, 20, 25 feet across, a couple of feet deep, just loaded with 17th century material. And the smaller pit in the center here, which is almost certainly a privy. But in terms of this evening's talk, we've got a cemetery. And there were 18 individuals, and some of them, well, let's go to a better view of it. There we go. I hope this shows up. More there. So I've color coded them. The reason I did that was because the color represents the approximate orientation of the grave. It groups those graves that have a similar orientation. And so we have one group which is in green, another in blue. Well, the blue are really a series of outliers. A group that is in red, and then in purple. The green ones were the first ones there. And I suspect they're the people who lived closer to the river at the Compton site, which is only about 800 feet away. The red are a subsequent group, and you can tell because they cut across one grave, number 11. So the red ones had to come in afterwards. So the people who were buried there, I mean, the people who were burying them clearly understood that there was a cemetery there. But they didn't have an exact idea of where the graves were or how they were oriented. The guys up at the north end in purple, they're almost certainly servants and/or slaves. And the reason we think that is, I think they're all men. but they're also buried further away. If we go back one, you could see the houses in the lower right-hand corner. The purple graves are the furthest away, and that suggests that it's a statement. It's a way of saying, this isn't your house. The wealth we accumulate through your efforts isn't yours, it's ours. So they're kind of separated. Also separated in the lower left-hand corner is grave number 15. In excavating her, it was pretty clear that it was a female, because when we got down to excavating her pelvic cavity, there were a lot of extra bones in there that didn't, we wouldn't have thought belonged there. And there were fetal bones. So this is a woman who died prior to childbirth. And I suspect she was buried separately from everybody because common in many cultures, and including Christian European cultures, is that a woman who dies in childbirth or prior to childbirth is ritually impure because the infant, the fetus, hasn't been baptized. And yet the fetus is in her. So she also is kind of polluted, contaminated. So she's kept separate from everybody else. We have grave number 10 here that busted through 2 different graves. And when we excavated grave number 10 and came down on the head, we found 2 piles of bones to either side of the cranium. So clearly, whoever dug that grave realized they were digging through earlier burials, and what they did, presumably as a matter of respect, collected up the bones and reinterred them with grave number 10. There's a lot we can look at with something like this from an anthropological perspective in terms of identity and who owns what in this society, and how identity is expressed and how access to wealth is expressed, and all those neat kind of scientific things that academics get really worked up about. Among the 4 graves at the north end, and this one right here, the second one up from the bottom, we found what appears to have been an older adolescent African-American. And he was really interesting because, some of these graves clearly had coffins. The wood was gone, but the nails survived. You could see shouldered coffins, not the one in the drawing, grave number 15. All of them had 1 or more bits of copper staining, green copper staining on their bones, because it looks like every one of these burials, each one of these individuals was buried in a shroud, and those shrouds were pinned closed with a straight pin. So we recovered straight pins in many cases. Sometimes they were just too deteriorated. But this grave over on the left here was kind of interesting because he's the only one who was buried with something other than coffin nails and shroud pins. He was buried with a tobacco pipe. This is the pelvic area, and so you're looking at his hands and almost certainly grasping that tobacco pipe. So that was, it was probably something that, he was one of those people who's probably never without his pipe, and so it was buried with him. There was also a metal button buried in there as well. With several of the graves, here's actually that tobacco pipe and that metal button. But if you look at the cranium on the left, you could see these almost perfect circles ground into the upper incisors and also to a certain extent in the lower incisors. Those are referred to as pipe facets, and they're caused by people clenching tobacco pipes between their teeth. And the clay tobacco pipes are hard and even a bit gritty, and so anybody who habitually smoked one of these things would develop those pipe facets. We do see them on women, and we see them on children. In the 17th century, everybody smoked. And this is one of the results of all that smoking. These teeth are all in really bad shape, especially this group here, and you could see the bone too. This isn't a matter of preservation. This is ante-mortem. This is prior to death. This is all infected bone. And most of that very likely was caused by the loss of tooth enamel from smoking tobacco pipes. So this is probably good for a poster on, do not smoke. Smoking will kill you. Another kind of project we do is probably mislocated in this particular talk is recovery. Sometimes we're digging a cemetery for the sole purpose of moving the remains to another cemetery because they're going to be destroyed. They're in the way of some sort of development project. As I was telling some folks before we got going this evening, this coming week, that's what I'm going to be doing. It's fairly rare when this happens, but we've got, it looks like as many as 3 graves that we're going to be excavating and removing the remains. First, they'll be looked at by an anthropologist, and then they will be reinterred in another part of the cemetery. But this is the Cole family cemetery from the 1880s. And when we got out there, it was essentially like a mesa. It's this little flat top hill in the middle of what looked like a large wetland. Well, what had happened is in the 1940s, this whole area had been mined for sand and gravel. And the cemetery was obviously there, so the sand and gravel guys just dug around it. Well, in recent years, somebody decided they want to redevelop that whole parcel. In order to do that, they had to remove the remains. We're fortunate in that the descendants of the family have one of their number at the time worked for, I think it was the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so she knew something about these things and knew what the family's rights were. And she insisted that the developer fund the removal of the burials and their reinterment at another cemetery. Because the excavation removal of human remains is fairly uncommon, we used it as an opportunity to involve local college students and some local members of the Archaeological Society of Maryland to come help. And so they got an opportunity to excavate remains. And some of you may notice this fellow over here in the lower left-hand corner. That's the late Jack Davis. He just died a couple of weeks ago. But there's mostly students here working on this under professional guidance. You could see this image down below, and I hope you could see my cursor moving around. This is an instance where we probably had an adolescent, a young adolescent, and the bones effectively demineralized. And so what we ended up with is a sort of clay model, the soil that infiltrated the bones before they dissolved. And so there's really nothing of the body itself, but you could see the outlines of the shouldered coffin, and you can see certainly the outline of the cranium here. We only, out of 7 individuals, we had 2 where we had bone. One was an elderly woman. We actually know who these people were. One was an elderly woman, and her bones, because women are more likely to lose calcium and more likely for their bones to demineralize as they get older. So she wasn't in great shape, and her husband, who I think died a few years earlier, was in pretty good shape. The bones were in good shape. And here you have an example on the left-hand side. This wasn't a coffin, this is a casket. It's rectangular, it's not a shoulder one. You can see another view to the right. We excavated that and there was nobody home. And it's not that somebody removed the body, it's that because of the nature of the soils and probably the youth of the deceased, the bones had not well ossified, so they didn't survive in the soil. In this case, you can see not only, this is the cranium here, not only do we have the skeleton, this, I'm pretty sure this is the male, the adult male, but what you're seeing here are actually bits of the coffin that survived. That's fairly uncommon. This is another one where this is the woman, I think. Very poorly preserved bone. This is the cranium here. This is the mandible. Not only were all her teeth gone, but the bone had resorbed. The holes where the roots of the teeth go in, it all disappeared. Bone had all filled in. So she was quite aged and also quite toothless. And some of the coffin hardware that were recovered as well. And all this material was reinterred with the bodies at another cemetery in Aberdeen, in Calvert County. but not, it was over a year after we dug them up because the remains went to Doug Owsley at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, where he did some analysis and produced a report that told us a little bit about pathology on the bones and diet and stuff like that. It was easy to figure out that the one person we dug up was a woman because she had this, I guess it's vulcanized rubber or maybe a celluloid comb on her skull. So this would have been a decorative hair comb. And then there's discovery, going out and finding stuff where you don't expect it or not finding what meets expectations, which challenges us as scientists. This is a project we did a couple of years ago. I think Amy Broussard is on the call here. She worked on this, as well as George Reisling and Olivia Williamson. But this is over in just south of Harrington, Delaware, just over the Maryland border. And the developer wanted to develop some of this cornfield into a couple of houses. And you can see in the background a chicken house, a poultry house, and also a little, looks like a pile of soil here. This is a back dirt pile. So this cemetery was in the middle of a cornfield, and we knew it was there because the farmers for years had plowed around it. And it was a mid-19th century family cemetery. Some of the stones have been lost or have fallen over the years, but several were still standing, and so we can get an idea of what family was there. It was the Harringtons, for whom the village was named. And the dates ran from, I think, probably 1850s through 1870s, something like that. So our job here was to take a piece of machinery and strip a 20-foot wide strip around the mid-19th century cemetery to see how far it extended. And once we did that, then we'd be able to kind of draw a line around it, and we could tell the property owner, okay, you cannot develop within, say, 25 feet of that line. We do this all the time. It's a common approach. You know, we don't dig up the burials, we're leaving them there, we're just trying to find the extent. So the dead grass to your left is the mid-19th century cemetery, and the machine operator is scraping off all the plowed soil so we could see if there are any additional grave shafts that run outside of that cemetery. So here we are in the upper left-hand corner. That's the cemetery. You can see some of the stones, and we've stripped around here. We're cleaning that surface. This is Amy here, and Olivia and George over here, kind of troweling and documenting what it is we see. Here's Olivia here, and you could see, maybe you can see, that there are, we've scored them out, there are these grave shafts here. But funny story, we found a cemetery that had absolutely nothing to do with the cemetery we were supposed to be looking at. See this, all this dead grass in here. You could see some of the stones. You could see our pop-up tent for lunch there. But this is what we were supposed to be looking at. We found all these grave shafts. This was done with a photo was taken. When it was taken with a drone, we had just started cleaning down this area here. We hadn't even cleaned most of the area with trowels. Nonetheless, you could see all these dark mottled areas. These are all grave shafts. And they're all in a different orientation from the mid-19th century cemetery. The mid-19th century ones, you know, they're all going pretty much east-west. But we've got all these grave shafts, and they're oriented in a different orientation. The upshot of it is, I think what we're looking at is we have an infant cemetery up here, and we have a cemetery that continues to extend north, in this case is to the left of the screen. A cemetery that continues extending to the north, so we haven't even fully defined it, but it probably is encompassed by this large dashed rectangle. So some of the mid-19th century cemetery overlaps it. What I think was going on was a little bit like that 17th century cemetery at Patuxent Point, where they knew there was a cemetery there, and they would just, you know, basically add to that cemetery. But they didn't have a clear understanding of what that cemetery was like, where the bodies were, how they were oriented. There are a lot of graves there. We uncovered almost 100 grave shafts. And presumably from this cluster, there are more in the area of the mid-19th century cemetery. And there are more extending to the north and possibly a little bit to the top of the screen, which would be east. It's too big to be a family, just your average family cemetery. What it's associated with, we don't know. In Sussex County, Delaware, or Kent County, whatever county we're in here, there is no archaeological review ordinance. You know, in many counties, several counties in Maryland, you know, if you're going to do a subdivision like this, you have to do some archaeology first. That didn't happen here. So we don't have a larger context for this thing. There may be a colonial era site nearby. We picked up several colonial period ceramic sherds in our cemetery excavations. So we know there's an 18th century occupation nearby. We know where the chicken houses are located, the poultry house, which would be far to your right. The guy who did the stripping here also did the ground prep with his machinery for the poultry house, and he said they found a whole bunch of brick there. I think probably what he encountered was the Harrington farmstead, which is associated with this mid-19th century cemetery. And these guys here are part of some other site that we've not looked for, much less found. So surprise, yeah, that can come under inadvertent discovery too. I did want to say a few things about cadaver dogs. That looks like Penta. A friend of mine, Heather Roach, trains cadaver dogs, and she also trains other people to train cadaver dogs. And she and I have been working together for the last 20 years here and there, different sites, and happily more frequently of late. And she's got these dogs who are trained to find human remains. We were working on one site, and I was standing next to the remains of a deer. And one of the dogs, I mean, they're crazy. They go run through the woods, madcap, sniffing around. And one came sailing right towards me, stopped, made a quick right turn, looked at the deer remains, gave it one sniff, and then went on his way. That's not what he was looking for. They are trained to find human remains. And we've used them on cemeteries that, 150, 200 years old, maybe older. And when they find something, they'll usually lie down, they'll bark usually, or lie down on the ground and bark. And that's what, indicating, they're saying, hey, there's somebody here. And you see that wire coming over partner's shoulder there. They have radio collars on too, so we can actually track their movements. So we can see what areas they've checked and not found anything. And we can see those areas where they've really focused and spent a lot of time on a particular area that suggests there's something there. They've been remarkably successful at not only finding cemeteries, but also finding outliers, outlying graves. So when we're defining the edges of a cemetery, we sometimes have to expand the boundaries a little bit to pick up those extra 2 or 3 outlying graves that they found. So here's Heather with, it's too small, I can't see who that is, but one of her dogs, and we were doing this at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Anne Arundel County, where we were taking the dogs off to a plantation cemetery. And on the way there, about 200 feet short of it, the dogs stopped. And they were running circles, and they started indicating on this particular spot. We brought them back 2 more times, and this is the 3rd time when we'd actually stripped off the plowed soil. And again, they would indicate on what looks like the very bottoms of grave shafts that we'd found. So here's a map of the grave shafts we'd found that we didn't expect. And we also found through metal detecting that there's a colonial era site associated with it. Lots of, well, not lots, but a number of hand-wrought nails and one ceramic sherd that's clearly 18th century. Unfortunately, when we tried digging these, sectioning them just to see what was going on, so here's a wall profile here. This, by the way, so we've got this here, this is in meters. We measured, do everything in Smithsonian meters. Here we don't have a meter scale, we have a foot scale. But you get a sense of the scale here. And this is what we found in profile. And here I've got it lined out in purple. These are the very bottoms of the grave shafts. They're gone. They've eroded away. And most of the associated site appears to have eroded away as well. There's very little soil left. once you cut through the, the forest surface and you cut through some roots and everything, there's very little soil that survives. So we think this whole thing is largely lost to erosion. So, what kinds of things do we learn from looking at these cemeteries? Well, epidemiology certainly demonstrated with the St. Mary's Cemetery in Baltimore. We can use gravestones in community cemeteries, and this is something we would have to do in collaboration with those communities. But we can collect essentially, if you will, beginnings of death records from stones. And by interviewing people and using other sources, we might be able to figure out what many of these people died from and the ages at which they died. And we can perhaps, without digging up any bodies, we can perhaps get some sense of mortality patterns in these communities and begin to understand why they weren't living so long, or maybe in some cases why they were living incredibly long. I haven't seen any cemeteries like that yet. So there's a lot we can do with epidemiology. And of course, if we're actually digging up the bodies, physical anthropologists can examine those bones chemically as well as physically. They can identify evidence of pathologies, potentially what killed these folks, certainly what their health was like. Through chemical analysis, we can potentially look at what their diet was like, what they were eating. Did they have periods of nutritional distress, where they just weren't getting enough to eat? So there's a lot that can be done in that area. World politics, very often we're out in the field, we're digging these sites, and we have some idea of when they were occupied, within a decade or so, and kind of generally what was going on regionally, nationally, and internationally. But cemeteries and domestic sites like the von Schwertner one are really give us a very deep sense of how world politics can affect an individual household. World War I really tore apart this family, and not because they were anywhere near where shots were fired. It was nationalism. It was this sense that I need to go home to my native land to fight for Germany. That really kind of tore this family apart. Von Schwertner ended up dying in, I think, 1921 in Germany. Never made it back to the US. Cemeteries are one way in which we find undocumented communities. And we see this largely with African American cemeteries. Obviously, we would see it with Native American cemeteries too, or ossuaries and other places where Native Americans put their dead, where we would not otherwise see these people. They would, in some way, kind of disappear from our consciousness. And as we find these sites, we can involve the descendant community that lives nearby and give them back a sense of their past, which has largely been lost. Archaeological investigation, again, there's a lot we can do with cemeteries, not necessarily excavating the remains. Generally, the attitude in the profession is to avoid, to leave people where they are buried. It's not always possible. And it's not always desirable. Sometimes, you've all seen these cemeteries in the middle of shopping mall parking lots. There's a little fence around them. There they are in the middle of the parking lot, maybe a couple of trees. And that's not how those people really wanted their remains treated. In those cases, it seems to me the best thing to do is to remove them to a more appropriate place of repose. But there's a lot we can do just by mapping out grave shafts. And this can be a little tedious, but mostly it involves removing the topsoil down to the subsoil. And we're looking for areas where somebody dug a hole before we got there and backfilled it. And in cemetery area, that's going to be a pattern of grave shafts marked by mixtures of soils, colors, and textures that stand out against the more or less homogeneous surrounding subsoil. And so mapping out these things, we can look for spatial patterns that tell us things like how even within a household, people were segregated and separated because they were segregated in death, just in where they were buried relative to others. So very clearly there are the people who were the workers at Patuxent Point who were buried separately. And we also see some quasi-religious sorts of attitudes and ways. So some people are separated in burial because they were ritually polluted, not because they were bad people or anything, but because, you know, in the case of that one woman, she died prior to childbirth and the fetus had not been baptized. We see confusion, you know, people recognizing that there was a cemetery and continuing to use that cemetery without really understanding where exactly people were buried and how they were oriented. Interesting thing about that Patuxent Point Cemetery is most of those people are not buried due east-west, which is, you know, in Christian cosmography, you know, you buried, your feet point to the east, your head to the west, the celestial gong goes off, you know, the sun rises, the sun being a metaphor for Christ, and everybody kind of sits bolt upright in their grave facing the rising sun. Well, most of those graves aren't oriented due east, and that's actually pretty common throughout Maryland, where you see lots of cemeteries where they're oriented probably to features of the built environment or relative to natural topography, and not according to any sort of east-west plan. So, what all can we do in terms of cemeteries? You know, what's our role here? What's your role? What are you doing here anyway? You should be out trick-or-treating. Why are you listening to this? What do you expect to get out of it? I think we all have some role to play in preserving cemeteries. If we can't preserve cemetery sites, then the larger issue of historic preservation seems to be moot. You know, if we can't preserve the resting places of the dead, why would we preserve the houses they lived in? And so we can all help by participating. You know, there are genealogical and historical societies around. They collect records, they note the locations of cemeteries, record what's on the stones, clean those cemeteries, sometimes help restore them, and make that information available to other folks. You can, without necessarily bending your back, but maybe contributing money or writing letters to elected officials, you can champion cemetery restoration. You know, it doesn't require a lot of money, but in order to accurately map cemeteries, to repair stones, you know, that does require a little bit of money. You can make maps of cemeteries, even though a cemetery has been documented. Okay, we know a cemetery is in a particular place and we have names of from the stones. Very few cemeteries of any size have been mapped. And there are two reasons for doing that. One, because, you know, having the names from the stones and death and vital statistics is not enough. If we have a map showing where these stones are located, then we can look at family relationships. Also, if some miscreant decides to steal a marker and use it as a, you know, in their front steps or as a coffee table in their living room, if we can manage to find that stone, the police have our documentation. They have a photograph of it, and they have a map showing where that stone was and is now in somebody's house. So we're actually providing good documentation that could help with prosecuting people who vandalize cemeteries. Learning the laws, these are usually state level laws, but learning the laws that govern protection of cemeteries. Most of us don't know what those laws are. We don't know what rights of access we have to cemeteries that are on other people's property, and all land is owned by somebody. You know, it might be publicly owned, most of it's privately owned. So most cemeteries out there are on private property. And so the question is, well, what rights do I have? Do I have right of access? And then finally, just studying history, you know, these are our predecessors, our ancestors. They gave their all. We can appreciate them largely by understanding what they've done to create the society we have today. So big supporters of history and archaeology. I think that's all I have. That is. So I will take any questions you might have.
Jim, the whole situation where there were a lot of graves that were not on the east-west orientation, I had not realized that it was common in Maryland for this to not occur. Is there any variation according to time period, religious denomination, or anything like that that makes a difference?
I don't really know. Denomination matters somewhat. However, you would expect Anglican churches, now Episcopalian churches, to have adhered pretty strongly to this pattern. But there's St. James Parish. There's an 18th century church in Anne Arundel County, just south of the South River. And Route 2 goes right by it. And as you're driving by, it looks like this, graves more or less are east-west, and continue throughout that portion of the cemetery that borders the road. But then you might realize that the road is actually curving, and yet stones still seem to be at the same orientation. That suggests that even without mapping it, it's pretty clear that all those graves are not oriented east-west. There's another one not far from there, a modern cemetery, still very active on Central Avenue, where it's on a west-facing slope, and all the graves seem to be facing west, not east at all. It really requires putting together a database of cemeteries with cemetery maps, and this is something Amy Broussard had been working on. And just seeing, yeah, there she is. Just seeing, can we find patterns? Do we find east-west? And the thing is, you have to map the cemeteries. And you also, while you're mapping them, accurately mapping them, you also have to recognize how they're oriented relative to, say, magnetic north. And once we have that data, then we could start looking for patterns and seeing if it is denominational or, maybe family cemeteries, they're just helter-skelter. I don't know. I don't have an answer to the question because the analysis hasn't been done.
When you say it's not uncommon to find them not in that orientation, can you give me an idea of how uncommon? I mean, is it most of the time, 50%? Any rough ideas?
I can't because I haven't collected the data. Amy, before she decided to run off to graduate school to study forensics, was working on this, and that's a fairly large database, but we need to add more to it and start looking at it statistically. So it's in the hopper, but we're a long way from being done. And the sample is mostly cemeteries I've mapped over the years. I think, what are we up, 40, 45, something like that? And we'll make more. But there's more data needs to be collected, and we need to do some good statistical analysis.
So at this point in time, the east-west orientation is a good factor to consider when you're looking, but don't count it as the holy grail.
I think it's one of those things that, yeah, we need to document it, and we also have to understand that east-west depends on, are you using a compass or are you using the rising and setting of the sun? Where the sun rises varies, like, I don't know, 15 degrees or so east, north or south of east, depending on the season. So if they're using the rising and setting sun rather than a compass or the stars or whatever, how they orient each grave is going to be a little different depending on what time of the year they put them in the ground. With larger cemeteries, with church cemeteries, community cemeteries, it's probably less an issue. I suspect it's more with, family cemeteries.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any evidence of cremation in any of the older cemeteries?
We have seen absolutely no evidence of cremations on European American or African American sites at this point. I think that's more of a very recent phenomena. A change in the Catholic Church, for instance, has made it more acceptable for a lot of folks, but it's also probably from sociological work done, I think, in the 1960s about the American approach to death and how it's been industrialized and people make a lot of money out of it. I think things like that have changed attitudes. We do see cremations on Native American sites. It appears to have been fairly common. And there's actually a book on ossuaries in Maryland by Dennis Curry, published by the Maryland Historical Trust, which compiles the information we have from a number of Native American ossuaries around the Chesapeake Bay. But we don't really see it in later ones. I know from my own work out in Arizona, cremations were quite common. You would find the remains in a Native American pot, and I'm talking about sites that date to around AD 1300, 1400, something like that.
Jim, I don't know, did you see the article about the woman who's been collecting recipes she's found on gravestones? And I think she's going to collate them into a book.
Recipes?
I think it's a great idea. Yes. The Post ran an article. I'll find the link to it and I'll send you the link.
I don't recall ever seeing a recipe on a gravestone. That's a little bizarre. The only thing I've seen out of the usual information about the individual and an epitaph, usually a bit of verse or whatever, is often on the back side of the stone, usually below grade, so you can't really see it, will be the mark of the maker of the stone cutter. And that's useful information because it tells us where they get the stone from. And it tells us a little bit about trade patterns and whatnot, and economic connections. I didn't talk about it all this evening, but really some of the most interesting cemeteries in this region are African American cemeteries from the early to mid 20th century. Partly because of poverty, but I think also because they didn't have a lot of trust in stone cutters, in Baltimore. They made their own, and they did it out of concrete. And so because concrete is so much more malleable than marble or granite, they would do all kinds of interesting stuff with it. They would embed, marbles in it or pieces of glass and make all kinds of patterns, and they're just really remarkable. And sometimes they'd make what look like your conventional gravestone, but they're actually made of poured concrete. And then they also often would take the vaults that we bury people in today, and most cemeteries require it, but instead of fully burying the vault, they leave the curved part of the roof of it above grade. And so, that's basically the box. And I've seen very often they'll use tar to essentially write the name of the deceased on it, even dates. And they're just remarkable. Some of them can be incredibly colorful. There's certainly a lot of research that can be done on them, and it requires no excavation, just mapping, photographing, and written documentation. There's easily a master's thesis in there for somebody, if not a doctoral dissertation. Okay, so next month I'm talking about these small houses that we find, or the remains of small houses we find throughout southern Maryland. A lot of them are African American, but not all of them. And then next month I'm talking about the aviation catapults at Pax River Naval Air Station. It's a lot more interesting than you might think. And I forget what the other topic was, but we'll get those advertised.